you want to have 10, 20 instances of Claude Code working your app, trying to break it, and also verifying the correct user experience. My name's Anthony. I've been working in the AI space for the better part of a decade now, and if you get to the end of this video, I'll tell you a little bit of overall strategy, how to work with agents like Claude Code or Anti-Gravity to be able to do that, as well as give you a little bit of tactile tips that can speed up your workflow and help, especially when it comes to running Claude Code in parallel. All right, so first thing is first, what are we trying to accomplish that we can't already accomplish with Puppeteer, right? So I'm sure if you're in the web space or even developing mobile apps, anything on the UI, you've worked with these basically Chromium controllers that allow you to set up test for making sure that a window opens, and then when a user clicks the correct behavior, the modal pops up. The problem is apps are making a fundamental shift from deterministic behavior to a more probabilistic user experience. If you've played with Claude at all, or if you worked with ChatGPT, there's a set of atomic units, right? There is a chat, and then there's images that can be displayed, and so on and so forth. But the order of those displays can change depending on the response structure, and especially when you're talking about longer user experiences, these things can be changed in very different ways, and you might want to evaluate the overall broad behavior for that. So we can't just stick to our stereotypical Puppeteer, Playwright testing, or I think Monkey Wrench if you're a mobile developer. And so we have to find a different solution, and that solution is creating an agent harness. And so if you've worked, and I'm sure if you're watching this video, you actually have, in the space at all, you're familiar with MCP, the Model Context Protocol, but there are some problems still looming when you're talking about developing with, let's say, Chrome, right? So there's an MCP server with Chrome, and you can't just set your agent off to go and test your application, because you're going to end up with a bunch of friction points. Those friction points are going to be the fact that maybe the agent needs to sign in with auth, or there's some information that's not easily understandable from the image or vision perspective of the agents. If you've worked with Claude Code, Codex, or Anti-Gravity, their visual capabilities are getting better, especially Google's, but they're still lacking in some places. There's some obvious things that a user would know, like a settings is going to probably be in the upper right corner or the top left, that if it's out of screen, if you're just taking a screenshot or looking at the DOM with Google MCP server, the agent won't be able to see. And so you need to set up an agent harness, or at least this is what I've done, and I found it to be immensely helpful. And what an agent harness is there's a couple different components. The first is you need to set up some entry points. And so these entry points are just global variables that give your agent access to your application, depending on whatever your application is. So you might have a video game, and it could be a progress bar, or you could have a scorecard that's surfaced to the LLM, and it can just call this variable and check on the status instead of having to render the DOM every single time and looking at the entire tree, parsing through it, taking screenshots, and potentially missing it. It can just call get user score. And so these are functions specifically surfaced through the global.window that the LLMs can then hook onto, and they can execute JavaScript in order to do that. So once you set up those entry points, you can then, and this is where it gets pretty easy, you can then choose whichever model you want to use. So you can use Claude Code, you can use Anti-Gravity, you can use Codex. I tend to be using, at least right now, Claude Code, because Anti-Gravity gets a little bit glitchy. And I'll share another tip on how to actually run these instances in massive parallel as right after this last point, which is what else you need for a harness is basically a skills file. And so just like any sort of agent workflow, you need some context. I just package mine in Claude Code has skills, Anti-Gravity has skills. Claude Code also has agents, which is really nice, sub-agents. I've been packaging my testing agents, if you want to call them that, or my agent harnesses inside of as a subagent, where it exposes these are the global entry points that you can hook into. You can call get student score in order to get their score. You can get grade and so on and so forth, so that the agent doesn't again have to parse through all the HTML and or use only an image. And then you can trigger those workflows. So in Claude Code, to get a little bit more tactile, specifically in Claude Code, I've been working with subagents because you can just set up a massive amount of subagents and they all work on different contexts, right? So it's not taking up the main orchestrator context. However, there is a problem with Chrome MCP, which I'll get to in a second. But before I get to that, if you've used Claude Cowork or Anti-Gravity, their browser integrations, like the overall intelligence of that MCP server that feeds to the agents, seems smarter than the default open source Chrome MCP server. However, if you're using Anti-Gravity, like I said before, it gets a little glitchy. And if you're using Claude Cowork, you can't run these in parallel. You can only run them one at a time. And I've tried this also with Claude Code if you run the Chrome extension. Now, I'm really hoping this gets fixed. I was checking online, and there's actually a GitHub issue for this that people are requesting. So I'm not the only person that finds this as a use case, which looking through the thread, there's some really interesting use cases in there. But how to actually get around this is inside of the default open source Chrome MCP server, you can just set up different MCP servers with a data directory, it's just a flag, or data-dir, and you can just set up 10 to 20 Chrome instances, and then just make sure you prompt Claude to assign for its subagents the correct Chrome profile or MCP server for the subagent, and just make sure that those are kept track of. All right. Well, I hope somebody finds this useful. I know I did. And until next time, see you later.